Greetings. This lecture is on the prosperity of the 1920s, both in the United States and Canada. The administrations of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge witnessed impressive economic prosperity. After World War I, America became a creditor nation. With foreign trade, it had a favorable balance of trade. America sold automobiles, farm machinery, electrical apparatus, and many other kinds of mechanical equipment to foreign buyers. The foreign trade probably would have been quite lopsided except for the large foreign loans and investments of Americans abroad. There was greater urbanization, technological innovation, big project construction, industrial productivity, and lots of optimism. New industries, greater mass production, standardization of consumer goods, better sources of power, new machines and tools, all this propelled America as an unrivaled economic leader. The American people had more goods to purchase due to affordable prices and generous terms for buying on credit. Economist Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Swartz writes that, quote, the 20s were in the main a period of high prosperity and stable economic growth. An enormous construction boom rebuilt American cities. The automobile reshaped American life. The bull markets in stocks mirrored soaring American optimism about the future. From 1921 to 1929, two recessions interrupted economic development, but both were so mild that many, if not most, of those who lived and worked at the time were unaware that they had occurred. The economic numbers were impressive. In 1920, the population of the United States was 106 million. 10 years later, it was 123 million. In the 1920s, on a per capita basis, the gross national product of the United States increased in constant dollars from 710 to 857. There was a significant increase in the output of manufactured products. An important factor was the major advance of technology. There were more patents issued in the 1920s than any previous decade. Earlier inventions such as the automobile, tractor, radio, and airplane became commonplace. The volume of manufacturing rose almost 40% from 1919 to 1929. Between 1920 and 1929, petroleum production increased from 443 million to more than 1 billion barrels a year. Although there were uneven results in different geographical regions, all Americans benefited from the creation of wealth and a higher standard of living. However, the decade began on a troubled note. The year 1920 was not a banner year economically. By mid-year, business began to slow down, and within months, America experienced an economic depression. Within a year, the index of wholesale prices fell from 226 to 143. And this is if we consider the 1913 mark as 100. thousands of businesses failed. Unemployment rose. A contributing factor to the Depression of 1921 was a decrease in exports. Merchandise exports fell from about 8 billion down to 4.5 billion. There was recovery in 1922 and the remaining years, with some slight interruptions. We see that there was some very exciting economic growth and good times. The Harding administration's economic policy of less government proved to be successful. Private industry made major gains, thus providing a high level of employment. Increased installment and credit buying generated greater consumer spending. Poverty pretty much disappeared. Manufacturers utilized more automatic and semi-automatic machinery, saving both time and labor. There was a huge increase in the use of electric power. In fact, electric energy for industry doubled. Frederick W. Taylor's ideas on scientific management received more attention by employers. Following Taylor's principles of rewarding the best workers and discerning the best method to ensure maximum efficiency, employers improved productivity. And we see that from the years 1919 to 1927, the average productivity rose 53%. The automobile business became the nation's largest industry, employing over 5% of wage earners. Motor vehicle registration increased from 1,250,000 in 1913 to 26.5 million in 1929. Motor vehicle registration, this is cars plus trucks. By the end of the decade, there was an average of nearly one vehicle per family. Mass production drove prices down. In 1924, Americans could buy the Model T Ford touring car for $300 or the Chevrolet Roadster for $500. By 1926, most cars, as much as 70%, were sold on the installment plan, which became more common for many retail sales. Automobile ownership meant greater opportunities for families to explore regions beyond their village, town, city, or state. On hot summer days in the summer, parking lots at beaches overflowed as citizens enjoyed a day of swimming and relaxation. Cars allowed people to pursue many other activities. In the 19th century, evangelists traveled the circuit on horseback. Now, traveling preachers shared the gospel in many towns and cities by way of trucks and cars. There were many other practical advantages. Motor vehicles spurred suburbanization and allowed employment further from the home. There were fewer trips to the grocery store as families could transport many bags of groceries. The widespread ownership of refrigerators and freezers made it possible to purchase larger quantities of meat and dairy products. The expansion of trucks lowered the cost of delivering consumer goods. And the automobile industry spurred other businesses. When more automobiles became closed car, the glass industry took off. Quote, about 15% of the nation's steel production went into the automobile industry, and the rubber, gasoline, lead, leather, and many other industries were heavily dependent upon automobile manufacturing, end quote. At the end of the decade, there were more than 54,000 garages and 56,000 filling stations serving customers. The mileage of surface roads increased from almost 400,000 in 1921 to over 660,000 in the year 1929. The petroleum industry made huge gains. Production of motor fuel alone increased from 86 to 439 million barrels in the years 1919 to 1929. So major jump in those 10 years, from 86 million to 439 million barrels. There was also great demand for new homes, and the housing industry blossomed, particularly in the suburbs. Quote, construction of new urban and rural non-farm dwelling units more than doubled from 450,000 in 1921 to 937,000 in 1925. As mentioned earlier, the refrigerator was a welcome addition to the household. In 1921, there were only 5,000 manufactured, but mechanical refrigerator production reached almost 1 million in the year 1929. Production of radios went from almost 200,000 in 1923 to nearly 5 million in the year 1929. The radio, with its exciting dramas, comedies, and sporting events, brought much enjoyment to people of all ages. Americans loved their telephones, and by 1929, there was one telephone for every 2.5 residences. The American Telephone and Telegraph Company was the largest corporation in the United States. The assets of AT&T totaled $4.2 billion. Economic prosperity certainly brought freedom and better times to families. People had greater choices with employment and entertainment. Americans ate healthier, including more fruits, vegetables, and food processed by better sanitary operations. Life was better. Stationary bathtubs and electricity were among important conveniences that many Americans experienced during this decade of prosperity. Driving much of this prosperity were machinery and iron and steel exports. Following predictable patterns, not every business experienced major economic success. In the automotive business, tough competition and subsequent concentration resulted in Ford, General Motors, and the Chrysler Corporation dominating the market. These three large companies. Thomas Sowell points out that more than half of new businesses in all sectors ended in failure within 4 years. The automobile business attracted investment and new car companies, which resulted in more cars and consequently lower prices. Prices fell too low for many companies, and they had to file for bankruptcy. The coal industry competed with natural gas and electric power. The supply of coal exceeded the demands, and thus prices came down, causing some coal operations to go out of business. The textile industry increased its output, but not at the same pace as other manufacturers. High competition lowered textile prices. The cotton industry in New England suffered when textile manufacturers moved to southern states to access cheap power, lower wage scales, lower taxes, and a non-union climate. The winner was the consumer, who paid less for clothes. The economic viability of the railroads was questionable. The railway industry had fewer profits due to competition from automobiles, buses, and trucks. In some cases, trucks offered cheaper freight hauling. And of course, the trucks could go many more, could go to many more places throughout the various regions. The railroad, obviously, were limited to where the lines went. Well, to favor the railroad industry, the government would later intervene with the Motor Carrier Act of 1935 that restricted trucking activities. But this here is another story. This is something that took place during the administration of President Roosevelt in the following decade. A key point of business failures was that consumers ultimately benefited. Americans paid less for goods and services. Turning to politics, throughout the 1920s, both the Democratic and Republican parties welcomed business leadership. At federal, state, and local levels, politicians were sympathetic of free market economics. The great majority of Americans were very supportive of business. Most believed that honest, thrifty, and hardworking people could succeed, including President Coolidge, who declared that, quote, "The business of America is business." Born in 1872, Coolidge grew up on a Vermont farm. His political philosophy echoed that of Lord Salisbury of the previous century. Quote, "The country is carried comfortably down the river by the current, and the function of government is merely to put an oar when there is any danger of it drifting into the bank." End of quote. In these years, the Secretary of Commerce was Herbert Hoover, and he aided business in various ways. For example, the Department of Commerce improved its statistical services to serve businessmen. Hoover also promoted American loans outside the country and encouraged exports. Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury, supported lower taxes. He argued that lowering taxes increased the amount of capital, which is put into productive enterprises, stimulates business, and makes more certain that there will be more $5,000 jobs to go around. Interestingly, Coolidge was wary that Hoover, and again, this is referring to Herbert Hoover, was too interventionist. So Coolidge was more aligned with the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon. This is what Coolidge later said or stated concerning Hoover, quote, "That man has offered me unsolicited advice for 6 years, all of it bad," end of quote. There were more problems of leadership actually in the previous administration, the administration of Warren Harding. Harding was a generous and unsuspicious man who made a huge error of judgment when he appointed Albert Fall the Secretary of Interior in 1921. Albert Fall leased oil reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Elk Hills in California to a couple of shady oilmen. The problem was that Fall had accepted loans and other financial favors in connection with the oil leases. Convicted of accepting a bribe, Fall fell from grace. He would serve 1 year in jail in 1929, but this was actually 6 years after the passing of President Harding. So justice can take time. As for Harding's economic legacy, Bruce Blevin, the anti-business editor of the New Republic, was the first to craft the narrative that Harding was the crook. Blevin began with a series of articles published in 1924. Historian Paul Johnson refutes this account. Harding was too trusting of some appointments, but he did demand answers from those who did shady deals. Johnson argues that Harding and his Secretary of Treasury, that is Andrew Mellon, did much to turn the economy around in 1921. They had done nothing except cut government expenditure by a huge 40% from Wilson's peacetime level, the last time a major industrial power treated a recession by classic laissez-faire methods, allowing wages to fall to their natural level. End of quote. With Harding as president, the Revenue Act of 1921 reduced normal tax rates. They were in the 6 to 12% range. They were lowered to the 4 to 8% range. Early in the Coolidge administration, Congress reduced the maximum normal rates 2%. The normal rate was 8%, and so thus it was reduced to 6%. In 1926, Andrew Mellon, who continued to be Secretary of Treasury, so he was both Secretary of Treasurer for the Harding administration and the Coolidge administration. Well, Mellon, he wanted additional tax reductions. The surtax, which is a tax levied in addition to another tax, was reduced to 20% from 65%. So a rather remarkable reduction. Also, estate taxes were lowered and the gift tax was replaced. Business and industry enjoyed the very favorable tax legislation. There was ample money available for productive enterprises, although upper income groups often directed their savings into stock market speculation. And of course, this would have a serious effect, a serious consequence later in the late 1920s. One interesting fact was that the lowering of taxes did not mean that the government had less revenue. Every year, the Treasury showed a substantial surplus. In 1920, the federal government's gross debt was over $24 billion. By 1929, the government reduced the debt to $17 billion. So again, the numbers were quite impressive for the 1920s, looking at the surplus and public debt. Another reason for this is that Coolidge and President Harding before him maintained smaller governments. There was a reduction of federal employees from almost 700,000 reduced to 560,000. The Coolidge administration had no interest in bringing in more regulatory legislation. Antitrust cases were rare. Antitrust laws represented legislation directed to see the elimination of monopoly and restraint of trade. The Federal Trade Commission Act had passed in 1914. It declared that unfair methods of competition in commerce are hereby declared unlawful. It was unclear how one defined unfair competition. By 1925, Republicans had a majority on the five-man commission, and they cooperated with business in working out acceptable trade practices. Pro-business attitudes also dominated the judiciary. Most courts were supportive of business. President Coolidge's critics castigated his smaller government approach, but the economic numbers were strong until the Great Crash of 1929. Now, turning to Canada, the economy north of the border shared some similarities with the American experience. In 1920, Prime Minister Robert Borden resigned and Arthur Mahan became Prime Minister. There was considerable agitation among many people upset over difficult economic times. So this sort of mirrored what had taken place in America, where the decade started off on a sour note. And it was the same in Canada. 1920, 1921 were not good years. Maritime politicians that is New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, they complained about economic misfortune. Prairie farmers in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, they complained about the tariff. And others complained about the lack of good jobs. The results of the 1921 election saw the Liberals win with their leader, William Lyon Mackenzie King, who had a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Except for a bizarre 3-day interruption, King stayed in power until 1930. Although King could be vague about his economic policies, he embraced a laissez-faire economic position. He attempted to take a middle position between protectionism and free trade. When the Americans increased tariffs in the early 1920s, King did not retaliate. In fact, duties were lowered on products such as sugar, textiles, and farm implements. King's balancing act was evident in the government's reducing the tariff on US car imports from 35 to 20% on products valued less than $1,200, and reducing the tariff on luxury automobiles from 35 to 27.5%. Although cautious, King supported the idea of reducing railway freight rates in the East to lower the cost of production and help sell maritime goods. King benefited from the good economic conditions that much of Canada experienced, except for the maritime provinces, which was hurt by limited primary resources, high freight rates, and uncompetitive consumer technologies. Canada experienced strong overall economic growth in the 1920s. Into the decade, the sharp recession of 1921 was mostly forgotten. Important exports such as wheat, pulp and paper, and minerals allowed the Canadian standard of living to rise. And one rather impressive statistic was the newsprint production of Canada. And actually, eventually it would exceed the Americans by a long shot. So pulp and paper, very, very important exports for Canada. There was some criticism in Canada that the United States did not meet the challenge of employing, quote, its tremendous economic might to restore some sort of stability to the international trading and financial systems. The economies of Europe needed to be restored, and there was the desire that American international investment replace the declining presence of British capital. And this, we have to look at British economic history and the fact that after the Great War, the British economic situation was certainly not as strong as previous decades. As it turns out, the United States felt free to pursue, quote, what it saw as national self-interest without fully accepting the burden that came with being the richest nation in the world. Canada was not immune to the volatility of the international financial system. There was the failure of the Home Bank in 1923, which saw 71 branches close their doors. So That was it for the HOME, bank, home bank. The Bank of Hamilton, the Bank of Ottawa, and the Merchants Bank were three of many banks forced to merger with stronger banks. At the end of the decades, three banks controlled 70% of the nation's banking assets. And the three were Montreal, Commerce, and Royal. Because of Britain's declining role in the Canadian economy, Canada looked to the South for capital. And yeah, this is a very important theme when we look at Canadian economic history in the 1920s, where we see the British and American investment in Canada. We see that the Americans, the number of investment rises significantly. If we look at, for example, 1930, there was 61% of total investment versus for the UK was 36%. After 1923, American capital imports, including investment, in Canada exceeded 50%. American branch plants, which was one answer to the tariff, accounted for much of this investment. Canada mostly welcomed American investment, whether in bonds, shares, or new branch plants. Canadian politicians wanted jobs, quote, created in Canada rather than the United States for the processing of Canada's exports. The economic link between Canada and the United States grew in strength. And the diagram there, we see exports from Canada to the United States and Britain in the years 1891 to 1929. And we see the percentage looking much more favorable for the Americans by the time we get to 1929. There was American demand for some key Canadian mining and wood products, notably newsprint, what I mentioned earlier. In fact, Canada became the world's largest paper maker, producing twice as much as the Americans, as that earlier table showed. And in return, 65% of all imports came from the United States. Now, if we look at the graph of 1891, we see that the percentage of imports from America had always been larger than for the UK. But as the years unfold, we see that the percentage of the UK drops and the percentage from the United States increases. And so we're looking at over 65%. In Canada, new consumer products and new technologies were growth industries. For example, quote, asbestos in brake linings, nickel and zinc in automobiles, and copper wiring in the new electrical devices of the market fueled the mining industry, end of quote. In 1900, total mining production was about 64 million. Well, in 1929, it grew to 307 million. Like in the United States, electricity became a common source of power in homes and factories. Electricity powered lights, refrigerators, radio, and electric stoves, all providing new and reliable comforts in the homes. In the years 1919 to 1930, the amount of electricity generated by Canadian utilities rose from 5.5 million to 19.5 million kilowatt hours. With more reliable refrigeration, consumers had access to a greater variety of foods. Theodore Pringle Loblaw had good success with his grocery business. By 1928, there were a chain of 65 Loblaws in Ontario. Given the size of Canada and its thinly spread population, it is no surprise that Canadians fell in love with the automobile. By 1929, there were almost 1.9 million automobiles registered in the nation. Only the United States had a greater number of passenger cars per capita. The automobile changed the layout of cities. The capital expenditure on highways was high, even greater than that in mining. There were many Canadian companies manufacturing automobiles in the early years, but by the end of the decade, these companies were replaced by branch plants of the leading American car companies. The last distinctive Canadian automobile was produced by the Brooks Automobile Company. But the Brooks Automobile Company ceased production in 1927. And from the diagram we see in the middle, Brooks, and the point that investors lost thousands on its on the Olan Brooks almost $4 million steam-driven car. Well, there's just no way that these Canadian automobile companies could compete with the Americans. Like the United States, Canada became more urban than rural. This is a rather interesting photograph of a so-called traffic jam in 1923. This is a traffic jam, and I'll just read. In the 1920s, the automobile became a part of Canadian life, necessitating many changes to the traffic laws. So rather interesting. The strong Canadian economy reshaped cities. And here is a rather interesting photograph of much more evidence of midday traffic and pedestrians. And this is the intersection of Queen and Yonge Street. This is in August 1929. And you see there's a single traffic cop dealing with this traffic. Vancouver experienced rapid growth, and a lot of that had to do with the completion of the Panama Canal in the year 1914. It became Canada's third largest city. The largest city was Montreal, followed by Toronto, and then Vancouver. Vancouver had a population of 218,000 in 1931. Even much Prairie Province grain destined for Europe was shipped by train to Vancouver. Now, although Montreal remained the largest city, Toronto began to challenge it for economic supremacy. The Oshawa, Toronto, Hamilton Golden Horseshoe experienced rapid growth. Winnipeg remained an important prairie city, but it underwent a relative decline. Now, as far as cities on the East Coast, cities in the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island remained small. There was no city of significant population, so it was falling behind with the rest of Canada, especially Quebec, Montreal, and the southern Ontario. By the end of the decade, a smaller percentage of Canadians worked in agriculture. In the urban centers, there was a rise of white-collar occupations which offered more job opportunities, that is like clerical and secretarial work for women. By 1931, women accounted for 20% of Canadian jobs. So with the rise of these white-collar occupations that did not require any kind of brute strength, there's more opportunity for women. Well, in conclusion, the 1920s were good ones for most Americans and Canadians. There was a sense of optimism as the people welcomed the entrepreneurial spirit of the decade. Thank you.